This is our third and final episode in the life of Martin Luther. By the way, I would strongly recommend that you get a book called Here I Stand by Roland Bainton, and you can read the life story. It's the best account of the life story of Martin Luther. But after Martin Luther became a preacher of the gospel, and after he began to try to reform the church, he felt like, well, maybe I need to have a wife. Because, of course, at that time, just like today, Roman Catholic priests and monks were not allowed to marry. And also the nuns were not allowed to marry. But as the Reformation began to spread, a group of monks, former monks, met with Martin Luther, and they said, we want a wife. Well, at the same time, there was a nunnery, it was called, where a group of nuns were saying, we want a husband. But they thought, how in the world will we be able to get from where we are to where they are? Because if they were to walk over there to try to make the trip, they would be arrested and put in prison. So somebody had the idea, let's smuggle them in and we'll put them in pickle barrels. And there were these great big barrels, and each woman got into a pickle barrel, and they put the top on it, loaded it up in a cart, and they drove it over to the monastery. And when they got to the gate, the people said, what is this? Said, oh, these are pickles. And so they took them on in, and when they opened all the pickle barrels, out came all these women. Can you imagine? And so each monk began to choose a wife. It sounds rather strange to us today, but one of them said, I'll take her. And she said, oh, good, that sounds great. And finally, all of the women had been taken except one, a woman named Katrina von Bora. And so Martin looked around and he said, well, who's going to take her? And somebody said, well, I guess you'll have to take her. So he said, well, I guess so. And so that's the way. That doesn't sound like a great romantic story, does it? And so she said, okay. And so she and Martin Luther were married. They were married the rest of his life, and she was a feisty and very, very helpful helpmate for him. He called her Katie, my rib, because Eve was taken from Adam's rib, and so he called her Katie, my rib. And she absolutely kept Martin Luther straight. Martin Luther had a tendency to get discouraged and depressed, as you can imagine. And on one particular occasion, he just got so depressed, he went and got in bed and just covered up, and he wouldn't get up, he wouldn't preach, he wouldn't do anything. And everybody was real concerned about him. They thought, well, what's going to happen to him? And she would come in, try to bring him food. He wouldn't eat anything. And so one morning she came in. She was all dressed in black. And that's the way women dressed back then when somebody died. And she came in and looking real sad. And he said, what's happened? Why are you dressed in black? She said, oh, you hadn't heard? He said, heard what? She said, God died this morning. And he jumped up out of bed and said, woman, how dare you? That's blasphemy. What do you mean God died? God can't die. And she said, well, why don't you quit acting like it then? And it shook him up, and he straightened right up. And he thanked her later and said, well, I guess I was acting like God had died, and my wife corrected me. And she was that way for the rest of his life. Now, Martin Luther was not a perfect man, of course. There are no perfect people except Jesus. And he had his flaws and he had his failures, but there were several things that he did accomplish. Number one, he brought back an emphasis to preaching. And his major focus was we need to preach the gospel and preach the word. And that was revolutionary in his day. Today, you go to churches and all your preachers are preaching the word of God. But back in his day, nobody was preaching until he started preaching. And then also, he brought a change in music. He believed Christians ought to be a singing people. And he wrote songs. In fact, we sing one of his songs today. It's called "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God," and you've probably sung it at your church. And he encouraged people to sing. He brought a renewed focus on the family as well. He and Catherine had several children, and he loved his children, and every night he would sit with them and read them Bible stories and sing with them. He was a great family man, and he also brought a new dignity to work. He believed that work was actually a gift from God, and that labor was to be appreciated. And he made the working man, the ordinary man, feel special, and most of them had felt very unspecial up until that time. So Martin Luther was an amazing man. I encourage you to study more about him, read about his life. There have been movies made about him. Ask your parents to get you a book on the life of Martin Luther, and see a movie about Martin Luther. And today, on this October the 31st, I thank God for the man of courage who on the 31st of October 1517 nailed those 95 Theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg, Germany, and started the Protestant Reformation.